Are we at the beginning of a great Christian revival? We're about to celebrate Christmas, which is, of course, a Christian celebration. But we are generally, I think it's acknowledged, living in a post-religious, post-Christian anyway, society. Ed West, who joins me now, has a very interesting piece in the magazine about the headline is "The New Theists," and that is a play against the New Atheists, who were the popular intellectual movement of the 2000s. Ed joins me with Mary Harrington of Unheard. Ed, let's start with you. What is the thesis of your piece? Just sum it up for our viewers.
Well, my argument is that in the last 20 years there's been a massive decline in religion. I mean, religion's been declining for a while, but especially in the US, where religious attendance and belief has hugely dropped since about 2000. And that sort of came at the time the New Atheist movement was very fashionable, pointing that religion was responsible for all these social evils. Christopher Hitchens, famous line, "Religion poisons everything," was sort of the best one. But there has also been a kind of range of new studies and books, social science data, suggesting that religion actually has a lot of social benefits in terms of well-being and lower anxiety, sort of community sense, but also Christianity in particular had a sort of hugely beneficial effect in the West. And there are so I sort of mentioned a sort of range of books. There's Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind was probably the first one. Tom Holland's Dominion's been very influential. There's also Joseph Henrich's The Weirdest People in the World, which is particularly about how Christianity shaped modern liberalism. None of these people were sort of believers, but I mean the question is that I sort of wonder about is whether people can actually sort of get the benefits of religion without actually believing, and whether also they can actually sort of meme themselves into believing. If enough people sort of take part in religious events and observance, then they will start to believe, which I think is probably possible.
Explain a little bit what you mean by meme, because it's a term popularised or coined possibly by Richard Dawkins, isn't it? Of course, who was the biggest new atheist of them all.
Yeah, it was come from the selfish gene. And he spreads a meme. A meme is like an idea that spreads, and it can be positive or can be negative, but it has a sort of benefit to the person who spreads it. And memes, like religion is a sort of popular meme. It's an idea that sort of spreads almost like a contagion, and we sort of see in politics now. I mean, lots of political sort of fashionable ideas spreads just by sort of repetition or sort of social networks. And obviously social media makes this much more extreme, and I think that's one reason why politics has kind of radically shifted since smartphones have come along, because it's just so much more possible to spread ideas, even kind of quite insane ideas, over huge populations. But I always think, but you can also use phrases often, people meme themselves into they sort of adopt a belief, partly because all their friends do. And they might even do it ironically, or they might even sort of experiment on an idea, and then they eventually sort of talk themselves into actually adopting a sort of a viewpoint or a worldview or a religion. And I think human beings are obviously capable of doing this. People meme themselves into all sorts of things.
Well, Mary, prayer is obviously similar to memeing in a way, isn't it? Because it's sort of repetition, endless repetition. And I think it's fair to say in America there has been this revival there's certainly a revival of interest in traditional Christianity. Is it becoming a fashion? Is it a new trend, do you think, that is emerging?
There are definitely people who seem attracted to the aesthetics more than they're particularly interested in the theology. I mean, and there's an unmistakable trend, at least in certain minority quarters, for so tweeting from mass, which is sort of ambiguous in terms of how it relates to actual religious devotion. But I think the important thing is that at least when at the heyday of observant Christianity in the West, it's almost certainly the case that more people were observant, regular church attenders and so on, than really believed in any sort of deeply felt sense. And and there's a sense in which this idea that the truly passionate faith should precede the worship is a very Protestant idea. It's a very sort of post-Reformation idea that says, you need to have this personal relationship with God, mediated only by the Bible, and that if that isn't coming to you with the burning force of revelation, then you're doing it wrong, and maybe you should do something else, or like not go to church. Whereas perhaps the older pre-literate relationship to the faith was that it was just something that you do. I'm quoting a friend's grandmother who said that her grandmother was the real traditional Catholic. So not these types who tweet from mass and ostentatiously have encouraged their girlfriends to wear the veil or whatever. But the actual traditional Catholics, because they only went to. She said her grandmother was a real trad Cath because she only went to mass twice a year and she believed in fairies.
Yeah. Ed, you talk about these new theists, and they do seem to be sort of people who were perhaps. Quite a few of them are either part of the new atheist movement or are liberals who are just slightly alarmed at what the secular world is doing to us. I wonder, just to be a bit cynical about it, I wonder, that all those new atheist books sold very, very well. Is it quite as popular a movement, or is it more of a sort of online intellectual phenomenon that hasn't really reached the masses?
I don't think it's anything like as popular. I mean, the God Delusion sold vast amounts, wasn't it? I mean, New Atheism was fashionable, and it's succeeded in part because of people were very influenced by what their peers and the people they look up to think and do, and people tend to follow those things. So, I mean, coming up with the argument as, actually Christianity produced liberalism and Christianity is really good, and maybe even we should sort of, take part in some of the sort of rights of it is not going to be anything like as fashionable or popular. And I think it's probably more kind of countercultural in the sense that New Atheism liked to present itself as this kind of rebelling against the mainstream, but it was very much pushing an open door. Religious decline was in huge, it was already happening anyway amongst the educated all over the Western world. I mean, it was partly motivated by a sort of fear of Islam, but it was sort of impolite to say that. And it was definitely provoked partly by 9/11. But actual Christianity was in such decline, it was actually sort of going with the grain of popular thought. I think saying that actually Christianity is good is very much against the grain in a sort of way. I mean, I do think particularly like Tom Holland's book, for example. I mean, Tom, he says he's not a believer and he sort of grew up in a kind of Christian environment and he cherishes that. And I think with a lot of people whose parents would have been religious and they grew up vaguely in a kind of occasionally going to church, and the level of secularization amongst their own children is much more extreme. And there is definitely a sort of feeling of loss, because once that goes, all sorts of other things go, the kind of common cultural literacy. I think even the sort of, the idea of forgiveness, which is, I think it is kind of counterintuitive, and I think now we're sort of learning that in our kind of cultural environment is very not into forgiveness anymore. I mean, the cancel culture thing is very much, not Christian in that sense, and there is a sense of loss, really.
No, I was want just to add to Ed's point about the new atheists and the mass secularization of society. I wonder if one of the things that's going on is that we are now a more secular culture than not. But the new atheist predictions about what would happen when we all became a secular culture have manifestly not been delivered. They promised a new golden age of rationality where everybody would be sensible, like Richard Dawkins, and that's manifestly not what secularization has delivered. And as we now live in a culture of mass unbelief, but the world is more insane than ever. And in a sense, it's more suffused with religiosity than ever. It's just a very untrammeled and very chaotic and sometimes very unwisely directed kind of religiosity, and people pour into all sorts of bizarre cults and personal fitness and Gnostic beliefs about their own physical bodies, and all kinds of bizarre things which have taken on the same sort of mantle of faith that was once sort of convened and corralled in a more structured way by a mass religious practice. And I think I think maybe not everybody, most people just prefer to mind their own business, but amongst people who think about things, it's becoming increasingly obvious that it's not possible not to be religious. That's just how human societies function, and it really is a question of picking which one. And I suspect that, amongst some more reflective, often quite young people, they've come to the conclusion that perhaps an embodied, redemptive, forgiving kind of a religious faith might be superior to some of the other options out there, and adjusting their behaviour accordingly. And in a sense, I think, well, if you're going to why would it not be possible to work backwards from that to some of the more sort of Protestant coded mystical forms of belief? That seems eminently possible to me. There's no obvious reason why somebody should arrive at the start of the road to Damascus one way or another. Well, I don't know, but I think it's just so obvious that Dawkins was wrong about what would happen when everyone stopped believing, that people are taking practical action.
Well, I think Chesterton said when people stop believing in God, they'll start believing in anything. Do you think, Ed, we're now seeing people are stopping to believe in anything and are now perhaps starting to believe in God?
No, I mean, I do think it's still a small kind of online thing, but I mean, these things might have the germs of the seeds of the future. I mean, I think in the sort of the irrationality thing, it's Dawkins, who I sort of respect and kind of love in a way. I think he's come across. He's one of the few members of the sort of new atheist movement who has really sort of kept his credibility, and he's been sort of long ostracized because he is sort of a deeply rational, highly intelligent person, and most people aren't. And the fact that a lot of the new atheist movement then pivoted towards kind of progressivism, it became new atheism plus, and it was kind of combating racism and sexism and transphobia and all these things, and it ended up sort of adopting very religious ideas about the world, and in particular on the transgender issue, where there is a kind of incredible intolerance about anyone who disbelieves in this. So it sort of went from sort of transubstantiation to transgenderism within a very short space of time. I mean, I was, even at the time, I think I was quite cynical about Dawkins, this kind of rational future, but it happened much quicker than I think anyone really expected. It became, as Mary says, very religious-like. But whether, I mean, the problem with sort of memeing yourself back into Christianity is, I do mention it is a very strange religion in many ways. It's very counterintuitive. It's much more sort of miracle orientated than other religions, especially Islam, for example. So in a way, it's kind of almost like the hardest one to embrace because its ideas are so against our kind of instincts in many ways.
Mm. Mary, Ed mentioned the fear of Islam earlier. I mean, with that was certainly a driver for the new atheism because it was after 9/11 and sort of terrorism becoming a huge problem, Islamic terrorism becoming a huge problem. Do you think that perhaps the revival of Christianity will also come, even though, again, it will be impolite to say so in polite society, will also come from a fear of Islam? Because people are looking at just the sheer demographics of it, and we can see that secular culture will probably be overwhelmed by a religious culture, and in the West or in Britain, it could well be Islam.
Honestly, I think it's unlikely that anybody is going to be inspired to a renewed flourishing of Christian faith just because they don't want more Muslims in their area. That just seems implausible to me, and not to mention somewhat incompatible with at least the sort of generally received understanding of what a Christian mindset is supposed to look and feel like. I mean, it's not impossible, but it seems to me more that where people feel they're themselves under threat from a competing ideology, they don't then adopt a new ideology in order to combat it. They double down on the one they currently have. So, I mean, I imagine a more plausible head-to-head confrontation I can imagine, which is actually cropping up already in some parts of America, is a head-on confrontation between strict Islam and gender ideology, and all that sails within it. The wider. The greater church of the rainbow, which is obviously at some considerable angle to observant Islam, not least on claiming that men can be women and so on, which is just obviously incompatible with Muslim traditional sex segregation. And you're already seeing vociferous arguments for example, I believe there was a school somewhere in the Midlands where there was a very strong parent pushback against a new curriculum that was brought in on sex education, which included a lot of gender ideology. And there have been there have been parents on the streets around some American schools in heavily Muslim immigrant communities in America, where they're resisting this kind of teaching. And I think, and if you see the Church of Rainbow as a church, which, I mean, as Ed has described, in some respects it sort of is. I mean, the idea that humans can change sex is so obviously factually false that if you believe it to be true, you can only be thinking of it in some sort of allegorical, metaphorical, spiritual sense, essentially. And if you're looking at them as two competing sort of accounts of what a person is, at a fundamental level, then I see that as a much more plausible confrontation. I mean, in my view, political Christianity is probably toast. I mean, perhaps not forever, but at least for the immediate and perhaps the foreseeable future. I don't think it's toast as a faith, but I think political Christianity in the form that's been so dominant in the West for some centuries is probably destined for a period in the wilderness at this point.
Ed, you touched on that in your piece where you said that well-off people replaced religion with politics, and by that I assume you mean in large part what Mary's talking about, the radical progressivism as a sort of article of faith.
Yes, I mean if you look at surveys, American liberals, I don't know about in the UK, but they place, I think like 1 in 3 place great emphasis on their politics as being very important to them, and it's something like 10% amongst conservatives, so it's much more on the left. People need some sort of moral lodestar and where it's not religion, it will be some sort of left-centered kind of worldview. I think on the Islam thing, it's kind of it's slightly unknown because what you're looking at is a sort of 3-way culture wars between sort of progressives and conservatives and Islam, so when it's kind of that complex, we're not sure. Sort of who's fighting who. I mean, even stuff like the British values stuff, which was sort of brought in the after the sort of terrorism of the 2000s. That was sort of basically people on the left using Islam as a kind of tool to sort of to win arguments against their conservative rivals, because it was basically just making British values were basically progressive values. And it made kind of like an unknown factor when you have a sort of new group who comes in, who might be used by one side to further their own kind of agenda, but they obviously have their own beliefs and they have their own kind of idea of what the world would like to be, which might not particularly fit in with the left's. I'm not entirely sure that Islam won't. I mean, I've become much more of the view that Islam will also basically be undermined heavily by progressivism, by secularism. I mean, amongst younger Muslims in Britain and the West generally, I think a lot of them are very much adopting the kind of same political ideas as other people. I mean, all this depends on also geopolitical factors might change this. I mean, obviously, if there's war, when people can adopt, people's religious identity can become much more important to them in the face of conflict.
Well, we've seen that with Gaza, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean the last few weeks, obviously, it becomes hugely important to people who might not have been thinking about it that much. I mean, there was actually, the question about people's religious faith. I remember there was data a while back showing that in England, where there was a large Muslim population, a large number of local sort of white British people did identify as Christian, even if they didn't actually go to church. So it obviously became more of an important identity to them. Not enough to actually, get back in the swing of things, but religion has always been very linked to sort of ethnic identity in many, many different places around the world. So it's not impossible that it could become a kind of locus for kind of identity conflict in the future.
The Church of Rainbow Expressivism is increasingly strongly US imperial coded. We only have to think about the US embassy flying the pride flag at the Vatican, or the immediate jump from of Afghan withdrawal to what's going to happen to the LGBT minorities there, and the sense in and the sheer volume of video content that came out of Ukraine in the first few weeks of that conflict, which focused on Ukraine's LGBT friendliness. There's a sense in which if you're an American ally, you're for this stuff, and if you aren't for this stuff, then you're not an American ally, and you'll be regime changed. So I think, to the extent that people want to present themselves as America friendly, it's being adopted as something, in a sort of Constantine-like way.
Yes, if you've ever been to any cities in America, the number of churches which actually are bedecked in rainbow flags is quite striking.
Yeah. It's particularly the Unitarian Universalists.
Yes, yeah. It's an absolutely fascinating subject, but we'd better wrap it up there. I thoroughly recommend you all read Ed's piece, which is in the Spectator's Christmas edition on Wave It Around. And thank you both very much for coming on to Spectator TV. And I wish you both a very spiritual and highly religious Christmas.